Tonight, to fact check, the media is saying Israel deliberately attacked a refugee camp in Gaza last night. Is that really a fair reading of what happened? Plus, the Albanese government goes weak on Israel. The Prime Minister seems dangerously confused. Also tonight, King Charles once again grovels overseas about Britain's history.
There can be no excuse.
Should Charles be prouder of Britain's past? And why are pro-Palestinian protesters so obnoxious, occupying the Deputy Prime Minister's office and throwing mice painted with Palestinian colours into a McDonald's restaurant? You don't see pro-Israel protesters being such bullies, which is telling. But first, the Albanese government's net zero plans, they're now in a shambles. And not just because of all the cost blowouts and delays. There's something else. There's a revolt by ordinary Australians, a revolt from northern Queensland to Tasmania against this mad idea that we should save the planet by destroying it. Of course, this was always going to happen, and now it has. Whatever made Energy Minister Chris Bowen think that Australians would accept having their landscapes ruined by wind generators that are more than a quarter of a kilometre tall? Plus, of course, 10,000 kilometres of hideous transmission lines to hook them all up. So yes, there are protests now around the country. In New South Wales, voters in 2 marginal Labor seats are trying to stop a huge wind farm off the coast above Newcastle. They protested again last weekend. Surfers against wind farms, really. Further down the coast, about 1,000 people rallied at Wollongong on Sunday against an offshore wind farm there as well. Some carried signs, "Save the planet does not mean destroy the oceans." In Tasmania, locals at Stanley celebrated this week after 2 years of fighting a planned wind farm there near the beautiful coastal outcrop called The Nut, a project now scrapped. In Queensland, the Friends of Challenbin group has been formed to stop another wind farm in a Nigeria adjacent to a World Heritage listed rainforest. The South Korean developer has halved the number of planned turbines to 42, hoping to buy them off. In Melbourne, in July, protesters drove tractors around Parliament House, furious about plans to build transmission lines across their land for the Western Renewables Link to carry renewable energy from Bulgana in Victoria's west to New South Wales. So you can see the government has got a huge problem here because the penny has dropped. Australians are no longer buying the government's green spin that it's worth wrecking our landscape with 40 new wind turbines a month over the next 7 years. That's what this government is planning. 40 big new wind turbines a month, plus 22,000 new solar panels a day. And for what exactly? Ruining the landscape for what? I mean, no one believes the government's claim that this green energy is cheaper. That's rubbish. And instead of cutting electricity bills by $275 like it promised, the government's instead seen a 20% jump in prices in just 1 year. And who really believes that Bowen's green plan will save the planet from a climate catastrophe? Australia's just too small to make a difference. And really, what catastrophe anyway? And people are seeing through all this. In fact, they're rejecting the government's other big claim that nuclear power is too dangerous and too expensive, that it's got to stay banned. Now that clearly was always ridiculous when there's been more than 400 nuclear power stations around the world operating perfectly safely and well. But until now, Australians have been scared off. They've been religiously anti-nuclear. But suddenly that's changed. And I guess that's because people, when they see the government's green schemes vandalising the landscape, they start to wonder if there might be another way if we really must get rid of coal. And they see now there is. The Essential poll this week found that Australians, once so anti-nuclear, are now 50% for it, with just 33% against. And no wonder. I mean, the beauty of nuclear power stations is that they're not just zero emissions. They don't just work 24/7, unlike wind and solar. The good thing here is you can hook them up to exactly where coal generators are now. You don't have to knock down a forest to set them up. You don't need new transmission lines either. You just hook them up to where the coal stations are already. Bang. No more landscape destroyed. So The game is up for the government's renewables crusade, which is already years behind schedule and vastly over budget. I mean, you just look at the Snowy 2.0 scheme to supposedly store all that wind and solar power for when it's needed. That's been held up for more than a year, may never even be finished, and total costs have now blown out from $2 billion to maybe $20 billion. But the cost blowouts are one thing. The bottom line now is this. Australians realise this planet is too nice to destroy in the name of this global warming religion of the inner city elites. The government's renewables crusade is doomed, and Bowen had better soon admit it. Labor's survival depends on it. There is one other citizens' revolt against the wind farms that I didn't mention. In the central and southern tablelands of New South Wales, locals are fighting plans to build 400 massive wind turbines in state forests. One meeting in Oberon, organised by a group called the Oberon Against Wind Towers, had 550 people come in a shire of just 5,000 people. Joining me is Chris Muldoon of Oberon Against Wind Towers. Chris, great to see you. Tell us about your group. Why was it formed and how much support does it have?
Well, the main reason it was formed is that we don't believe that there's a social license to come into our community and basically carpet bomb it with wind towers. That Forestry has openly said there's going to be between 350 and 625 towers in our region. And they've also openly said they're going to be up to 285 metres tall. So we don't feel that Oberon is the right place for this infrastructure. We have a growing tourism industry. We have a significant agricultural industry. We have a very strong timber industry. We don't need the renewable energy. We don't need the renewable funds. So, you know, we're not against the rollout of renewable energy. It's important to make that point. But we feel that the government needs to take a more considered and responsible approach to the location of infrastructure.
Well, you and a lot of other groups. Joining us is local New South Wales Nationals MP and opposition frontbencher Paul Toole. Paul, thanks for your time too. What is the big picture here? What is this big plan with wind farms in this area?
Well, I think what we're seeing, Andrew, is a destruction of the landscape. We're actually seeing profit being put before communities. And again, we've got a state-owned corporation like Forestry Corp that have heard very loud and clear for the community that they don't want these wind turbines in this local area. And Chris is right. We're talking, close to 400 wind turbines. But let me put it in perspective. These are going to be on the top of the ridge lines. And you look at a pine tree, it's about 40 metres in height. These are going to be 285 metres in height. So they're as nearly as tall as what the Centrepoint Tower is in Sydney. And this is going to be sprinkled all over the landscape. And it's just unacceptable to see these proposals being put in this community. The community's already made it loud and clear. They don't want to see this happening. And we really need these proposals in these communities and other communities across the state to be stopped right now, because they are not the fix at the cost of communities like Oberon.
Yeah, Chris, just on that response that you've had, I mean, where you get 550 members or locals to one of your meetings, that's a lot. But what has the government said in response?
Look, the government has been very, very quiet. The Forestry came to an Oberon Council meeting recently, or a couple of months ago, and they basically told us, look, you don't need to do anything here. This is a project which is 8 to 10 years away. But we know, as we speak right now, they're sitting there and they're plotting where they're going to put these wind towers. So we want to put the pressure on now. We're not sitting back and waiting. And we're also very, very, we don't want to plug ourselves into the process. We're not going to sit there and wait for environmental impact statements. We're not going to sit there and do their social engagement for them, their community engagement. We're staying away from that. We just want to let everyone to know that they're not welcome here in Oberon. There's no social license here. And as you said, 550 people in the community have come forward and said, yeah, we agree. We also have another issue at the moment. There's a private wind farm which has been on the back burner for 20 odd years. Has reared its ugly head just recently, and they've lodged an environmental impact statement which our community has been unable to access. So just today, we've lodged a legal letter. We sent it to New South Wales Planning said, you've got to withdraw that project and you've got to fix up your website because our people have been unable to access that information. So the community engagement
too. Fair enough.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now, look, absolutely. If you don't know what the project is, how can you possibly lodge an objection, have any informed view on it? But Paul, looking again here, I mean, you've got Chris's group in this area, in your area. You've got those protests up and down the New South Wales coast. You've got protests in Queensland. You've got protests in Tasmania, all against wind farms. You've one in Victoria as well, against the transmission lines to them. Put it all together, what is going on with the government's plan to build 40 big wind turbines, the size you're talking about, every month for the next 7 years?
Well, it's absolutely ridiculous, and this is not going to fix our energy problems here in the state. And what this is actually doing is actually coming at a cost to community. And I made the point, Andrew, at the very start, this is actually destruction of the environment just for these renewable projects. And what we're also going to see is the land is going to be cleared where these projects are going to be put in. We're also, people wanted to actually wake up and open their window and look at a concrete building, then they live in the city. They don't want to be living out in regional and rural New South Wales and see the skyline being sprinkled by these wind turbines that we're going to see. This is going to impact on people's house prices. The community of Oberon, they've already said that the rural landholders in the area have said, no, we don't want it. But we seem to have a state-owned corporation that seems to be just pursuing this full steam ahead at the cost of the community. And what I believe here is they're putting profit before our communities. And unfortunately, Forestry Corp should be focusing on their core business. And that's actually growing trees that are needed here in this state. What we're also going to see is where these wind turbines are going to be put in, we're going to see more trees taken out. We're going to see the transmission lines being put in. So more land's going to be cleared, and it's ultimately going to have a massive impact. But that's not on top of all the other issues, Andrew, that I could say where these renewable projects are going in as well. Not only are there wind turbines, but there's solar farms. They're going on prime agricultural land. And this ultimately is the food bowl here for this country into the future. And if we keep putting all these solar farms and wind turbines on this type of land, then we're going to run out of sustainable food here in the future for this country. We've got to stop. The governments have got to go back and rethink how we look at energy going into the future, because it shouldn't be at our cost. The other point I make is, people in the city, they, and I get a lot of people saying, oh, they're a great thing. But these are the people that live in the city. And I know they're the first ones that would be screaming and jumping up and down if they were on the eastern shoreline and they had to look at these wind turbines each and every day. They changed their opinion very quickly there. But at the moment, when they're in someone else's community, someone else's backyard, they feel all fluffy about it. But I'll tell you what, think about them in your backyard, because you wouldn't like it either.
And particularly if you're someone who wants to be in the countryside, you do not want to live surrounded by things that make you feel you're in an industrial park. Chris Muldoon, Paul Toole, thank you both so much for your time, and good luck to you, Chris, in your struggle. I appreciate your time. I've been so frustrated today about some of the reporting about an attack by Israel last night. It's reporting like this from the BBC. Jabalia, Israel airstrike reportedly kills dozens at Gaza refugee camp. Just goes and bombs a refugee camp. And here too, on Sky, I got to admit, we were running reports that Israel deliberately attacked a refugee camp, and, horror and dismay. Well, let us be clear. What Israel actually attacked was a military centre of the Hamas terrorist group that runs Gaza. A military centre that Hamas deliberately concealed in tunnels and rooms under that refugee camp, which is really a city now, which is why there is such a big crater, because, reporters say, locals saw sinkholes opening up, the ground giving away underneath them after the bombing, which suggests tunnels collapsing under their feet. Now, what's more, Israel had warned residents for a couple of weeks to leave that area, but Hamas told them to stay. And that's because, as I showed you last night, the leader of Hamas actually saying, you saw him, he wants women and children to actually die, civilians, Palestinian civilians, to die, to give Palestinians what he called revolutionary spirit. He wants human shields and he wants them to die. Now, Israel says the bombing actually worked. It killed the local Hamas commander, one of the leaders of the October 7 terror attack on Israel, plus about 50 of his terrorists who were using that compound and the tunnels underneath for training and operations. Yet, once again, Foreign Minister Penny Wong, I'll have something more to say about her in a second, refused to back Israel, implying somehow it did wrong.
The destruction of the Jabalia refugee camp, it happened as Israel was targeting a military, a Hamas target. Is that reasonable? Is it proportionate in response to the atrocity perpetrated upon Israel and its civilians?
Well, certainly the images out of that attack are very distressing. And what I want to keep saying is Australia continues to assert the importance of international humanitarian law. As I said, even in conflict, we have rules that all of us, Israel, Australia, and countries throughout the international community have signed up to, and it is incumbent upon Israel to do all that it can to protect civilian life as it engages militarily.
More on this sinister game that Wong is playing later in the show, but first, joining me from Tel Aviv is regular guest filmmaker and commentator Ami Horowitz. Ami, how much frustration is there in Israel over the coverage in the West of what's going on?
Absolutely incredible outrage. You know, I'm in Tel Aviv right now. I mean, I've been all over the country. I've been in Ramallah. But right now I'm in Tel Aviv, and I'm out at night. I'm having drinks with people. We're talking about the situation, obviously. And these are all people of the left that I'm talking to, right? That's what Tel Aviv is, the center of Israel's left. And every single one of them understands the game. They're not confused by this, by their fellow left travelers in the international news media. They understand that these guys have an agenda and they're disgusted by it. Look, they're looking for things to confirm their bias, right? Confirmation bias. But it's more sinister than that because do they really not know that the hospital, for example, that Israel supposedly hit wasn't really hit or killed by them? Or the refugee camp just mentioned, I can't imagine they're that stupid, right? Either they're stupid or a liar. It's a game I play all the time. You're either lying or you're just playing dumb, right? No, they're looking for these examples. They jump on them because they want to believe it for whatever reason they want, right? You could say it's anti-Israel bias, anti-Semitic bias. I don't know what it is. But the point is that we know for sure they are looking for a reason to jump on these. They don't vet them properly because they fit their narrative. That's what's happening here. This is not new. This has happened time after time again when Israel gets involved in military action, whether it be in Gaza or the West Bank or wherever. Look, I was just in Jabjulia. Jabjulia is a Arab village, completely Arab village here in Israel. And I wanted to ask these Arab Israelis, how do you feel about the coverage? You see this going on. Do you think Israel is striking civilians on purpose? Because that's what we're talking about here. They look at me like I was crazy. They said, of course not. They said, look, our heart bleeds. These are all our fellow Muslim Arabs for sure. And our heart bleeds for anybody being killed who's innocent. But they said Israel's not trying to kill them. Israel's trying to avoid casualties. It just happens. They understood that, right? Look, if Israel wanted to kill civilians, like purposely, Andrew, they'd all be dead. There wouldn't be 5,000, 6,000 dead. There would be 500,000 dead tomorrow. Israel had the capability to flatten that place and make it into glass. They choose not to, even though their soldiers are in harm's way. It may be easier to flatten it all, and their soldiers' lives would not be at risk. The soldiers wouldn't be dying like they are today, going through buildings and booby traps because things are still standing. It's a game the media is playing. It's a sick, revolting game.
But it's funny, you know, I have seen interviewers, believe it or not, Army, on Egyptian TV, on Saudi Arabian TV, actually being tougher on Hamas than the left in Australia, than this government, this Labor government in Australia, saying, for instance, why don't you build tunnels and bomb shelters for your own people? Why do you leave them up on the surface to die? Because they know that's Hamas's game. That's what they're saying. I don't hear the Labor Party here say that. Now, how do you explain why so many on the left have turned against Israel? You know, I think is it because Israel represents capitalism. They're successful. Israel is richer, and we all, the left has to hate the rich guy. Is it because they're whiter than the people they're fighting? Is that it? Is it race? What is it?
Yes. I was going to say it was going to take me like 10 minutes to explain it, but you just explained it. Look, it just comes down. There's a reason why there's an intersectional coalition backing Gaza and Hamas. It's because they look at Israel. Israel is a more successful country, obviously, in the region. In a region of lack of success, there's success, and they're a model of the West. The left hates that. The left has always had a war on excellence, right? Because by definition, if one place is excellent or one person is successful, in their warped mind, it means that somebody obviously was unsuccessful, because the only way one country or one person could have been successful was stepping on the neck of someone else. And in this case, I go, oh, it's so obvious. Israel's successful, high-tech sector, wonderful economy, great high level of education and living standards. The only way they could have gotten it was by stepping on the neck of the Palestinians and their Arab neighbors.
Correct.
That's the thinking of the left.
So totally. It's funny now that you mention it. I was thinking the only time that the left really went for Israel, really supported it, this is back when the film Exodus was made. Hollywood wouldn't make that again. Was when it was just starting, so it was struggling, and it was full of kibbutzes, full of socialists. Socialists were in the government, etc., etc. We're going to share, we're going to live the Marxist dream. But since it's become more explicitly capitalist, all that support is gone.
You got it. Okay, I'm not that old. I wasn't alive when that was going on, so I can't tell you exactly the move then, but yes, you got it exactly right. Israel was considered a decolonial power at the time because they threw off the yokes of the British. And then the only reason why the Soviets actually voted for Israel's existence was this weird quirk in history where they thought Israel was going to become one of their orbit satellite countries because the kibbutzim, that they were going to become socialist. And in fact, for the first few generations, they were, with a little bit of a Jewish capitalist bent, and they have moved over time decisively to be more of a free market society. And you can see how the anti-Israel sentiment has grown with the success of Israel, because the success came from becoming free market. And as that success continued to ramp up, you can see along with it was the hatred of Israel.
I think that's so true. And how tragic and sad and ironic in a sick way that the prime victims of the attack by Hamas were the kibbutzes that were for peace and sort of socialist values along that border area. The whole thing's so sick. Ami Horowitz, keep safe. Thank you so much for your time. After the break, I mentioned Penny Wong. How Anthony Albanese's government is betraying Israel and our Jews. There's no leadership at all. Penny Wong's going nuts. And among the worst is the Foreign Minister. The panel after this. Now, warning, some distressing content I'll discuss coming up. The Albanese government, it is throwing Israel under the bus, and it's letting down Australia's Jews as well, when there's never in my lifetime been so much anti-Jew hatred. I've got friends scared of going on the street. The government is giving no leadership at all. In fact, it's speaking with a forked tongue. Now, it's true that Prime Minister Anthony Albanese today was still saying he stood behind Israel.
Israel has a right to defend itself. Hamas's terrorist activities horrified the world.
Now, I've got to say, though, that activity seems a very mild way to describe what Hamas, the terrorist group which runs Gaza, actually did to start this war on October 7, slaughtering 1,400 Jews, raping women, beheading captives, burning babies alive, taking 240 hostages. In fact, and this is, I was going to show you the clip, but it might be too confronting. The US Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken, said overnight he'd seen evidence of Hamas actually mutilating parents in front of their children. How? I won't say. Then mutilating their daughter in front of the parents before killing them all four of them. That is what Israel is up against. And that's what Albanese actually means by terrorist activity. But all right, he did at least concede the barest minimum. Israel has a right to defend itself. But today again insists that Israel should restrict itself in fighting back.
But how it defends itself matters, and we want to see all innocent lives protected.
Israel is never going to do to Palestinians what Palestinians have just done to some Jews, 1,400 of them. But how can Israel defend itself and still protect all innocent life in Gaza? As Albanese put it, all innocent life. Well, you saw that Hamas command post that got bombed last night, hidden in a refugee camp. And the people around there told not to leave by Hamas, even though Israel had sent warnings for a couple of weeks. Leave this area. Danger. But if Albanese is weak on Israel, I tell you some of his ministers are outright hostile. Two of them, Ed Husic and Anne Arley, have accused Israel of war crimes. Another, Tony Burke, backed the Canterbury Bankstown Council flying the Palestinian flag, the old flag of the Palestinian Liberation Organisation. But Foreign Minister Penny Wong is, I think, the most poisonous. For instance, she's even accused Israel of committing murder, you know, like the Hamas terrorist group.
What I would say is this is a dreadful, tragic conflict. We are seeing loss of life. We are seeing civilians on both sides have been murdered.
She's also given $25 million of your money to help Palestinians in this war that their own government started, and without demanding Hamas first release the hostages. She's posted a tweet of herself with the Palestinian activist who's called for the destruction of Israel from the river to the sea. Since then, she has tweeted not one direct criticism of Hamas by name or criticism of the Hezbollah terrorists in Lebanon who are firing rockets at Israel too. But she has just criticised Israeli settler violence against Palestinians. Priorities. Joining me is the panel, Michael Costa, former New South Wales Labor Treasurer, and David Gazard, former Senior Liberal Advisor, now Head of DPG Advisory Solutions. Michael, what is going on with the Labor Party?
I think the Labor Party is deeply conflicted on this issue. It shouldn't be, but it is. And part of the problem here is, and let me say that in terms of Anthony Albanese, anybody that's known Albanese would be actually surprised at how firm he has actually been on this issue, given his history. So I'm not going to criticise him. We want the Prime Minister to be firm. However, he's got a major problem, and the problem is that he's got ministers, and two of his I suppose, least able but most ambitious ministers are from the New South Wales right, in terms of Burke and Bowen and others, who are have got large Muslim majorities in their seats, and they seem to be pandering to that rather than the principal issue. In terms of Penny Wong, I think it's outrageous to be seen anywhere near anybody that's tweeting or using that slogan, from the river to the sea. In fact, those people should be treated like the Ku Klux Klan. You can imagine if a Conservative stood next to, and we had this actually under Tony Abbott, where he stood inadvertently next to some posters and was criticised, to the point of him being destroyed personally at times by some of these people. The same thing should apply here. Any person that's mouthing that slogan to the river or the sea should be treated by the ALP as if they're standing next to a Ku Klux Klan person or a Nazi. I mean, the fact of the matter is that's what they're calling for, the extermination of the Jews. And, Labor's got to get hard on these issues, but I think the conflict is real, and it reflects the decline of the right in the national ALP. In relation to that flag, Andrew, I've got to just make the point, whilst Chris Minns has been good, he needs to get the Office of Local Government. You've got to remember, local government is regulated by the state, to pass a regulation or give an order that all these flags, no matter what they are, be pulled down other than the national flags that we recognise.
How about the national flag? All other flags but the national flag.
Well, at least the Palestinian flag should be down.
I just got to be fair to the guy that Penny Wong was standing next to. I don't think he wants to exterminate Jews. He just wants to destroy Israel. That leaves the question: what happens to the Jews? I don't know that he's addressed that at all. So I want to be fair to him. He wants the destruction of Israel. I don't know about the rest at all with him. Others, I'm not so sure. But, David, talking about, Michael has said Albanese has been strong, given his past history, which has been anti-Israel, but he hasn't pulled these people into line. And that makes me wonder, one, first, is Tony Burke doing this for leadership ambitions, saying, stuff you, Prime Minister? Two, has Albanese actually lost authority inside his party after its defeat in the vote for the Voice?
It's a really difficult one for him because Michael has touched on this. And Anthony Albanese, as member for Grayndler, has spent 25 years standing with Palestinians in their struggle against Israel in demonstrations. He stood against the US for decades. He was with Mark Latham when he was leader, saying that Australia was in the conga line of suckholes, and now as PM, he's got to go against that. He's been mugged by reality. He's now for nuclear power, nuclear-powered submarines, when for decades he's been opposed to them. So he really is split as a leader with his past actions. But to Michael's point, the principles of this seem lost in just the pure politics of it. And it won't take long before the Conservative side of politics sees on this, because he is quite right. When it came to equivalence, Tony Abbott was howled down for standing next to a poster, and Pauline Hanson was howled down, and no one could preference Pauline Hanson. That's been the state of play for 20 years. How long before the Liberal Party starts saying, well, you can't preference the Greens, who've been even more extreme left on this issue than the Labor Party?
Oh, excellent point. I think their behaviour here has been shocking, repeating outright lies about Israel, showing no sympathy at all, really. It's just disgusting. Michael, the Prime Minister is off to China on Saturday, just days after coming home from his United States trip. So much travel. What can we expect from the China trip? Is anything more than from the last?
Look, I think this trip is completely out of line at the moment. I think he needs to be in the country dealing with domestic issues. Look, I understand this is the 50th anniversary of our relationship with China, but look, what they're offering, some minor trade benefits that they withdrew in the past. And I've always said that trade is a mutually beneficial arrangement. If the Chinese don't want to take our wine or barley, that's their problem. We'll have to find other markets for it. My problem with this is that, whilst you've got everything going on, particularly the reaction to the events in Israel, is he going to raise the question of the occupied Tibet there? I would hope so. I mean, a lot of in the Labor Party are obsessed with occupation and colonial power politics. I think there's a good opportunity to raise Tibet while he's over there, and maybe the Uyghurs as well. I mean, I just think that you can't play both sides of this game. Either you're condemning people for protecting themselves, or sections of your party are, at the same time you're going to the worst colonial power. I mean, it is the number one colonial power of the region.
Good point. But David, as Michael says, this visit is to mark Labor Prime Minister Gough Whitlam's visit to China 50 years ago, seen as a deal, a big door opener. To me, there's a risk here. It sounds more like a PR stunt, as much for China's benefit, where Albanese will be at pains to demonstrate, the significance. Gough Whitlam did it. I'm continuing it. Labor is friendly to China, always was. I'm not sure that's quite an appropriate stance given China's aggression.
I know there's some senior Liberals who believe that Anthony Albanese is more concerned with how he goes down as Labor leader, his legacy as Labor leader, than he is as Prime Minister. We saw that with The Voice following Gough Whitlam in changing the Constitution. The thing I would say about China is that it's completely asymmetric. China can jail the people it calls spies without charges and leave them in jail. It can slap embargoes on our trade products whenever it wants, outside, and it thumbs its nose at the World Trade Organization. It can do that. It's completely asymmetric. Australia will not engage in those sorts of tactics. And all of these have been brought about because China was upset that the previous government wanted an inquiry into the origins of COVID, which was fair enough at the time. So the question that has to be asked of the trip, which, by the way, will come at a time when the RBA looks very likely to lift interest rates, so the Prime Minister will be out of the country while people are suffering another rate rise. But what will Australia have to give up in order to get wine back on track, or barley back on track, or, recently hay back on track? Because all those have had embargoes slapped on them unilaterally by China. What negotiation tactic does Australia bring to the table to get these products flowing?
You mean it wasn't enough that we said, OK, you can keep the Darwin port? Well, there you go. They want more. David Gazzard and Michael Costa, thank you both so much for your time. After the break, the government's net zero scheme being blown apart by grassroots protests against the country against its wind farms. Like I said before, but I'm going to talk to Matt Canavan about that after this, and he's going to tell us about this conference in London he's at. Now, I've been telling you this week about that huge new conference in London to kickstart a new conservative movement called Alliance for Responsible Citizenship. And as you know, I've interviewed founder Jordan Peterson, last night Ayaan Hirsi Ali as well. Great people. You can go to skynews.com.au and see the interviews if you missed it. Well, there are also a lot of Australians there, including Prime Ministers John Howard, former ex-Prime Ministers John Howard and Tony Abbott, and politicians such as National Senator Matt Canavan, Bolt Report regular and former Resources Minister. Matt, great to see you. I'm starting to feel sorry I didn't go myself, because particularly since the Israel trip I was going to go on is looking a bit iffy now. But before we go on to today's news, what should we know about this conference? What are you getting out of it?
Well, I think from an Australian perspective, there is a great hunger to rediscover what we as a conservative centre-right political party should stand for, should fight for. We lost an election last year, I think at least in part because we departed from our basic principles, values and foundations. And when you don't jump off a solid foundation, you're not going to go very far. So if nothing else, I think this is hopefully putting some steel back in the spine of some of my colleagues, which we'll bring back to Australia, and obviously also use the example of The Voice. Jacinta Price is here as well. She's got a rock star welcome, of course, and we've really got a solid basis and foundation for that. On a more specific matter, I think the other thing that is very, very obvious here is there is a building backlash against the radical net zero agenda. And as a centre-right party, as a conservative movement, we can't credibly stand behind any form of socialism, Andrew, including the radical green form of socialism, which otherwise masquerades as net zero emissions. I mean, net zero emissions is all about putting a massive handbrake on our nation's ability to develop our own energy resources for our own use. And we need to release that handbrake, get rid of net zero emissions, so that we can once again be a country of energy abundance. We can lower power bills for struggling Australian families, and we can keep and hopefully build the great Australian industries that provide so much wealth to our nation and also allow us to protect our wonderful country.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned that. I mean, I'm glad you say it's going to stiffen the spines, but unfortunately the politicians I see there don't need spine stiffening. There's Abbott, there's you, there's Jacinta Price, James Patterson, Andrew Hastie. If only you could bring over some of your other colleagues, that might be interesting. How about Simon Birmingham? But to bring those two things together, fighting for a principle and then the green energy stuff. At the top of the show, I mentioned all the revolts now going on around the country against wind farms. At the same time, the polls are showing a lot of support for nuclear power instead. Now, this is an issue that the Liberals have run away from for a long time. They're now coming back to it just under Peter Dutton, and large part, thanks to the Nationals. Should the opposition actually go further, make this a big issue in the election, go in harder with a definite promise to drop the ban on nuclear at least, and maybe even invite bids to build a nuclear power station? What do you want to see?
Well, the short answer is yes, Andrew, and the slightly longer answer is just before I came here, I was at our political party conference, the LNP conference, and we passed a resolution to impose a moratorium on large-scale solar and wind while we make sure we can protect our environment, protect farmers' interests, protect prime agricultural land, get the regulations right. They're clearly not in place right now, and that's why you've got this revolt coming from the bush about these large industrial projects. So I think we should get behind that. But absolutely also, I think I can't see us not taking a pro-nuclear policy to the next election. There's obviously a lot of details to work out there. I hope that we make sure that we keep all options on the table for nuclear energy, because if we're going to go down this path, we shouldn't be half pregnant. We don't have time to start looking at lots of different technological options. We should take what's off the shelf and can be built quickly to solve the energy crises we have this summer, coming up this summer. We need to do that now. So, look, I saw those polls as well as you earlier in the week, and they show now that a plurality of Labor voters support legalising nuclear energy. So Chris Bowen and Anthony Albanese have completely lost the debate on this issue. They've even lost their own voters, and we would be mad not to take advantage of that, go with the will of the Australian people, and as I say, bring forth a new era of energy abundance for our nation.
Yeah, they've lost the debate even before it's properly started. I find that amazing that the resistance has fallen over so fast. Quickly, a couple of the citizens' revolts I mentioned were against the Albanese government's plans for offshore wind farms built off the coast. But in the US and Britain, we're now seeing offshore wind farms being cancelled because the economics don't stack up. What are the problems, and what does it mean for the government's plans here?
Yeah, look, we're attending this party, if you want to call it that, the offshore wind farm party, when everyone's gone home. There's no one left. And here in the UK, they've just had an auction for offshore wind farms. There were no bidders. They had no one bidding for the subsidies, the large subsidies that the UK government was on offer, principally because of those escalating costs for offshore wind. So it's not clear how these will even get going in Australia with that lack of investment around the world. But once again, like with their onshore cousins, the offshore wind farms have huge environmental issues. We've heard from Michael Schellenberger here, an energy expert in the United States, and he's shown that these offshore wind turbines in the east coast of the United States have caused a doubling of whale beachings over the past 10 years. So, again, I find it strange, Andrew, that I'm here before you defending the koalas from wind turbines offshores. I'm trying to save the whales from these radical greenies who want to kill them with offshore wind turbines. But here we are. So I'll do my best to protect all the wonderful life on this human earth.
Mate, good on you. We're so pleased you will do so. Matt Kenneman, thanks for your time. Really appreciate it. After the break, King Charles grovels again, this time to Kenya. Is it time that he stopped saying Britain was so terrible? Patrick Christie's after this. I wish the King had more pride in Britain. But it seems that every time King Charles visits the West Indies or Africa, he's got to crawl. He's got to grovel. He's got to apologise for Britain's wicked colonial past and pretend it was 100% evil. And it's the whole same story again on his visit this week to Kenya, where activists are hoping that after sorry comes reparations, free money.
The wrongdoings of the past are a cause of the greatest sorrow and the deepest regret. There were abhorrent and unjustifiable acts of violence committed against Kenyans as they waged, as you said at the United Nations, a painful struggle for independence and sovereignty. And for that, there can be no excuse.
Joining me from London every Wednesday is Patrick Christie's, star presenter on GB News, which also, by the way, now has the fastest growing news site in Britain. It's on its way. Patrick, the King's slamming of British history in Kenya, the right thing to do, or is he letting Britain down a bit?
Well, it's absolutely the wrong thing to do. The King is supposed to be our envoy around the world, not going around on an international apology tour. And they're trying to spin it as the King stopped short of full frontal apology. Well, that's just a technicality. That was an apology. And we've seen it time and time again from the royal family. There was a lady whose real name is Marlene Headley, who went by the name of Ngozi Fulani and then dressed in full African clobber and attended an event at Buckingham Palace. She took a great umbrage as a member of the royal household, Lady Susan Hussey, who'd been the Queen's closest confidant for decades, asking her where she was really from, which might have been slightly clumsy, but also not the most ridiculous question, given the circumstances. They then apologised to her, but a little bit like this, Andrew, an apology is not enough. Next comes the handout. Next comes money. But, you know, for the Kenyans, we have actually given them billions of pounds over the years. They are a member of the Commonwealth. In fact, £132 million investment in Kenya went there just a couple of years ago. And can I just say, you know, whenever we see incidents take place in this country, if we see a terror attack or something like that, we don't ever expect an entire community to apologise for the actions of one rogue individual. So why should our entire country now, and every British person living in it, and our current serving monarch, apologise for things that had nothing to do with him? Where are our reparations from the Norman conquerors or from the Viking and their ancestors, you know?
Look, it's true. And the other thing is, you know, couldn't he say, well, listen, there are bad things we did. There's good things we did. I mean, the intertribal slaughter we helped to ameliorate. We gave you democracy, even if Kenyans don't always live up to it as they should. We gave you the gifts of the English language. We gave you the rule of law. I mean, there's many institutional things. I've been to Kenya. I look around and I think, wow, if the British hadn't been here, this place would not be quite as good as it is. Not that the Kenyans have quite lived up to the legacy they were left.
Yeah, exactly. But also, if it hadn't have been us, it would have been someone else. I mean, the French were at it, the Portuguese were at it, the Spanish were at it, everyone was at it, OK? So if it wasn't the Brits that had gone in there at that particular moment in time, it would have been somebody else. And I don't see these other countries queuing up to apologise either. But it just ties into something else that's really going on in this country as well, which is, you know what kids are going to be taught in school today, don't you? That our king has gone abroad to Kenya and apologised for our past, which gives teachers another excuse to teach youngsters in this country now that Britain's past is terrible and that we were an evil force around the world. I mean, I've always said this, and I always will. The world has been very lucky to have Britain, actually, and at times it has been a gift to the world. Yes, there were historic wrongs. Yes, there have been things that have gone wrong because things were different. Times were different back then. That's not to excuse them, but we shouldn't be apologising for those things now.
No, no, and no. Patrick, I'm just wondering who's running British foreign policy. Your Prime Minister is totally behind Israel. He's not calling for a ceasefire, went over to shake the hand of Benjamin Netanyahu. But your Lord Mayor of London, who's a Muslim, has a different foreign policy. There he is.
Thousands of innocent civilians, men, women and children have already been killed. I joined the international community in calling for a ceasefire.
That's almost seditious, isn't it? I mean, undermining his own government's policy. What's going on here?
Well, he's undermining his own government's policy. He's also undermining the leader of his own party, Sir Keir Starmer, who is also not calling for a full-blown ceasefire. He is calling for a humanitarian pause to proceedings, which, again, I think is a technicality, I suppose, isn't it? But look, we are at the moment in a situation where we have a huge groundswell of opinion from a variety of different communities, mostly predominantly the Muslim community in this country, who are desperate for a ceasefire. They see this as a genocide against Muslims abroad. Now, a lot of these people are incredibly quiet when it comes to the actual genocide that took place against Israeli citizens and some of the heinous atrocities that took place there. But something that might have flown under the radar was that a new party was attempted to be registered with our electoral commission here just days after that Hamas attack in Israel. And that party, Andrew, was called the Party of Islam, which did not publish a manifesto but said that it vowed to stand for minority groups. Now, the concern there is that there has been a huge element of the Labour vote, of the Labour Party vote, which is a large Muslim vote. We have around 4 million of them in this country, who are now pulling away from the Labour Party, who conceivably, had the Party of Islam been accepted by the Electoral Commission, which it has not been, it's important to say, had it been, though, you could see there that we could have a fundamental religious-based party in this country flourishing out of something that's taking place thousands of miles away.
It's so dangerous. Patrick, I've got almost no time, just 2 seconds, but I find pro-Palestinian protests tend to be in your face, even violent, pro-Israel ones not. People here today, pro-Palestinian, blockaded the office of the Deputy Prime Minister 5 people arrested in Birmingham, England. Pro-Palestinian protesters painted boxes of mice in Palestinian colours and released them into a McDonald's restaurant for some bizarre reason. Well, that tells me something. But Patrick, I've run out of time to ask you your opinion. Sorry about that. Talk to you next week. That's it from me. Coming up next, Chris Kenny.